We are studying the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 4 is where we're going to be this morning. And we're going to finish up Revelation chapter 4, move into chapter 5. And to kind of help us get an idea of what we talked about so far in chapter 4, grab your lesson sheets if you have them. Let's answer the questions for chapter 4. That'll be an easy way for us to review what we studied on Wednesday night as it relates to chapter 4. And then we'll be set to kind of wrap up chapter 4 and move into chapter 5 this morning. So if you have your question sheets, grab those, and I'm going to show it to you on the screen as well. The questions that relate to chapter 4, we'll use these to help us review what we looked at again Wednesday so that we can finish up chapter 4 and move into chapter 5 this morning. So note he says, as John looked and beheld in heaven the majestic throne and court of the ruler of the universe, he was in the what? He was in the Spirit. And we talked a little bit about that on Wednesday, but as far as I can understand, the basic concept is that it seems to me that he is saying, I did not literally go in heaven and see these things. I saw them in the Spirit. It is not as if John was literally translated into heaven to witness these things, that within himself, within his spirit, he was able to see these visions that were revealed to him and as it relates to the things that he saw. And so that was what I took from that description that was given in that thought. The one on the throne was like a what? Yeah, like a jewel, if you want to generically say it. Two particular ones, what were they? Jasper and a sardis or a sardine. That's what I keep saying every time I see it. But a sardine stone there as well. And around the throne was a what? Was a rainbow. And remember, we talked about a couple of different kinds of concepts. But generally, when we think of rainbow, you think of what time period? That's right, flood, right? The days of Noah. And what did the rainbow signify? Yeah, covenant, right? It signified a covenant relationship between God and man. And so you see this rainbow over the throne. You see the idea of a ruler and his covenant with his people in relationship to that. Describe the 24 elders around the throne. Okay, so there are basically two things I think that jump out at us. One is they were dressed in white raiment. And what's the other thing? Okay, they had a gold... each had a gold crown. The idea of purity, generally when you see that idea of white, and a reward. We talked a little bit on Wednesday about the fact that my conclusion is that this crown of gold is something that God has bestowed upon them, not something necessarily that they've earned as their own personal value in themselves, something that God has bestowed to them. And you'll see that a little more when they lay those crowns down in chapter 5 before we're done. What proceeded from the throne? That's right. Lightning and thunder. And there's one other thing, by the way. There you go. Voice. Okay? This isn't just noise and flashes of light and grandeur. This is education as well. There's voice. John is not only seeing things, he is hearing things being shared with him that he is revealing from throughout the whole of the book of Revelation. The 7 lamps of fire are those 7 spirits of God. And we talked about the fact that number 7, that perfect, complete number in the book of Revelation. So the perfection of the Spirit as it fulfills the purposes that God has. Describe that sea. Okay, and glass like crystal here in this text. What about in 15:2? Yeah, and also referred to as a sea of glass, but that fire kind of context there as well. And then in 21, what's interesting? No more sea. Okay, no more sea. And by the time you get to chapter 21. What we kind of talk about Wednesday, the sea being a a barrier, right? The sea is a barrier between two entities. And so initially, there's a barrier from getting from where John is to where God is on the throne. But by the time we get to Revelation chapter 21, and we have gone through the entirety of the Revelation almost, by the end of the narrative, we have changed the concept that there is a barrier between us and God to where now we can be in the immediate presence of God. And so this message from chapter 1 through chapter 22, first priority, victorious Jesus. First priority, if you don't learn anything else from the book of Revelation, if you learn nothing else, learn that one concept. Jesus reigns victorious. Because if we miss that one, we miss the most significant message of the book. But also appreciate that because He reigns victorious, we can reign victorious. And ultimately that will include being able to be in the more immediate presence of God. Early Revelation shows a barrier. Towards the later end of the Revelation, that barrier is going to have the ability to be removed through Jesus and a greater relationship with God. And we'll get there. Okay, don't jump into chapter 15 and 21 yet, because we got a lot of ground to cover before we get there. Describe the four living creatures around the throne. They're full of eyes, before and behind, or just they can see what? Everything. All right, you can see everything. The first was like, in terms of the beast, a lion. The second, the calf. The third, a man. It had the face of a man, and then an eagle. And we talked out of Ezekiel. We talked about some other texts that use these similar kinds of imageries to show power and service and the swiftness and grace of an eagle, the intelligence of man. These depictions, but I'm gonna give you a very simplistic view of the beast here before we're done with chapter 5. So give me a chance. I'll get there. Each had 6 wings and was full of eyes. Again, that idea that, and the concept is that God has the ability through these symbolic beasts to see everything. God sees it all. It's a picturesque way of saying what Paul had written, that all things are open and what? And naked to God. God sees it all. It's the same thing. It's a symbolic way of representing the same concept, that God is able to see everything. Because if you're being oppressed and you're being persecuted and you're being harmed by some government entity or anything else for that matter, what's the temptation to think? That God doesn't see this. God's unaware that I'm being harmed. God is unaware that I'm hurt. And so in the imagery, here's these beasts, and here's this picture. God has at His disposal the ability to be able to see everything. God isn't unaware. God is not unaware of the challenges. They do not rest day or night, praising whom? Praising God there, the Lord Almighty is the specific description given there in that text. And then when the living creatures praise God, what do the 24 elders do? Okay, they fall down and worship. Okay, they fall down and worship, and specifically, they cast their crowns, right? Which we're going to eventually see. Okay, so that's where we're at. So jump back into the text, because that's where we're at. Verse 9. Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think that two things we have to remember. Number one, um, it's the familiarity with other texts like Ezekiel and these other imageries that have already been, it's practically identical, highly similar imagery that have already become familiar with. to demonstrate the power and the glory. And I'm not saying this just to you or to any. I say this to myself as well. I have a tendency to have to be careful, and I say this to the class as a whole. Sometimes with the book of Revelation, we want there to be more there than there actually is. We want it to be bigger than it actually is because it seems bigger than it actually is. And that's why I find myself really always seeming to simplify these things. I don't know. I can't tell you what John's thinking when he sees these things. I can't tell you. I don't know because he doesn't say. He doesn't really. There are moments where he'll give some tidbits, but for the most part, he's just telling us what he sees. And his role really in many senses, well, if you remember, go back to earlier in the text, his job, Jesus said to him, I'm going to show you things, and you're going to hear things, and I want you to do what about those things you see and hear? Write it down in the book. He didn't say, I want you to give an explanation. He didn't say, I want you to interpret, or I want you to give an. He just said, you're going to see things, hear things, write it down in a book. And I think that's what he did. He saw things, he heard things, and he wrote it down in the book. And I know we want more, but it's all we have. You know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, you can definitely at times see the concept of you write it in this form so that the audience that has the greater grasp of what's revealed is shrunk. In other words, the Roman soldier sees this, finds this book, and he looks at it. Is he going to deem it a threat? Probably not. He's going to see it as an unusually written material. There could be some of that. That's all speculative. You know what I mean? You can't. It's reasonable to say, well, they want to write the book in a way that has a limited audience, so the Romans won't understand it and they won't see it as a threat, and it'll be able to be. But I also, with that, go back to the fact that if somewhat speculative thought in relationship to the idea, he said, write it down in a book. If you restrict the number of copies, if you will, and that book has to travel instead of dozens and dozens and dozens of copies, you also limit the ability for this to fall into the wrong hands and somebody see it as a threat if you shrink the number of availability to the actual writings. And so there you can there are dozens and dozens and dozens of those kinds of thoughts. Go ahead, Jim. Yeah. Yeah. And there is that here too. That you're trying to I say John is trying to explain things. Let me restate that. John is writing down things that he is seeing and hearing in a realm in which we don't belong yet. And it is an incredible challenge to me to try to take this heavenly place that really how do we have much concept? We don't have we don't have a concept of eternity. We can talk about it, but we really don't understand the idea of no time. How do you describe that? How do you describe a place that's so beautiful and yet it's funny because the Bible's very specific about not thinking of heaven like the earth. And yet, when it tries to describe heaven to us, it uses earthly terms so that we can get some kind of picture. If you're asking my 2 cents, I don't know that any of this is literal. When we start talking about the pictures of jewels and gold and seas, and they to me describe a picture of what's happening in the relationship. And how can we bridge the relationship? Jesus. How do I get across the sea? Jesus. How is there an answer to our oppression? Jesus. That's the answer every time. The Savior is the answer. And so I don't know whether we're agreeing, but my contention is that this is a challenging work to try to take spiritual concepts and things from a spiritual realm and bring them into earthly terminology that can make some kind of sense to those who read it. And that's again where the difficulties come. And I suppose that's why the book of Revelation has created more controversy and challenges than any other narrative within Scripture. Is because there is such a wide... Well, I'll give you for an example. If you read from Pulpit Commentary on the book of Revelation, I believe there were 12 different descriptions of these beasts, of what people thought they were. And he just listed 12. He could have kept going. And that's where you run into trouble with this book, is we want more specific. We want this beast to be somebody. You understand what I mean? We want the one that's like a calf to be somebody. We want the one that's an eagle to be somebody. So we can say, oh, he means that's this ruler, or he means it's this martyr, or whatever it might be. And I think that's where we run into problems with the book, when we try to over-ascribe the picture to try to make it mean something more specific than it does. Yeah. And so that's a difficulty that we have. And you're right, Jim, though, back to your original point. What a challenge to try to take a spiritual realm and put it in physical context. So when the beast in verse 9 of chapter 4, give glory and honor and thanks to him that sat on the throne, who liveth forever and ever. So they begin to worship. Okay? Then the 24 elders fall down before him that sat on the throne, and they worship him that liveth forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne. Now remember, if we're correct in this picture of, and you think of 24, you think of the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles, bridging the two eras together. And if that depiction is correct, then this is a tremendous imagery, because you have both eras bowing down to whom? And Jesus in the picture, eventually. The throne of God, both eras joining in the worship that's going to be offered to the Lamb here in chapter 5 in just a moment. And so it's an interesting picture of both eras, the time of Moses and the time of Jesus. 12 tribes, Israelites, through Moses and all that history, and the 12 apostles joined together in worship here around the throne of God. And initially, thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. Simplistic thought for you. Even these magnificently interesting descriptions of 4 beasts, and one's got that one looks like a lion, and another one looks like a calf, and another one looks like an eagle, and another one has the face of a man, and they all have 6 wings, and they got eyes all over them, and this tremendous picture. But even as grand as the beast is, they all still do what? They all still bow down and worship God. Even the beings of heaven fall down and worship God. he starts making the connection to the Lamb. And so again, I think that it's a highly fascinating description of what he's seeing. But the point is they're not just the description of these characters, but the ultimate lesson is that even that which seems so grand and powerful and marvelous within itself, at the end of the day, still has to do what? Still has to worship God. It still has to worship God. And still wants to worship, absolutely. And lay their crowns down. The glory is not ours. We lay our gold crown before the throne of Jehovah. All right, move into chapter 5, because they really do go hand in hand. Maybe. Oh, it froze. Well, isn't that interesting? Sorry. It's the first time I've seen that happen. Complete. Well, no, it's moving. Maybe it'll come back. I can move it, but I can't change it. Can I even close it? No. Well, I apologize. Unless it's my finger. Maybe my pen. Oh, it's my pen that died. My finger works. There we go. Okay. So chapter 5. He says, I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne a book written within and on the backside, sealed with 7 seals. Now, when he says book, most likely he's talking about a what? Scroll. Okay, they have, leather bound with the monogram on the bottom. It's not the way they did that. Their books were in scrolls. Okay, and so if you're going to write on a scroll, you might write on both sides. And so John is able to see this scroll well enough that he can tell that there's writing where? On both sides of it. But he can't what? He can't read it. Can't tell what the message is. He can see it well enough that to note that it's written within and on the back side. But it's sealed with 7 seals. Now, you can, to me, I'm an either way is fine with me. You can view these 7 seals as the idea of a perfect seal. I'm okay with that imagery because we use that number 7 to account for the idea of something that is complete. So this is perfectly sealed, or it may just mean that it's so well sealed that here's one, and then you go a little further along the scroll, and here's another, and you go a little further along the scroll, and here's another, and you go a little further along the scroll, and here's another, to demonstrate either way that at that point in time, that scroll is not going to be what? Yeah, you're not going to be easily open, and it's not going to be able to be read until it is. That's the point. And so here's, and if it's got a message of some kind. And so I'm in the Spirit, I see the vision, I see a scroll. It's got to be important, right? Because it's where? It's in the right hand of him that sat on the throne. So here's God on the throne. That's the vision. And in his right hand is a scroll. And it's obvious there's a message. It's not just parchment. It's not just paper. There's obviously a message. And the problem is, nobody can get to it. I saw a strong angel, verse 2, proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof? There is a difference between ability and worthy. This scroll wasn't just about who's strong enough to open the seal. The seal was more about who is worthy. Who is this seal was not opened by the strength of men. The seal was not broken by the ability of some man who comes along and says, I'm powerful enough or great enough to be able to break the seal. He says, who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof. That's the angel's proclamation. No man in heaven, nor in earth, nor either under the earth, was able to open the book, neither to look thereon. Now, keep in mind, who is around this throne still? Who hasn't left? The 24 elders and the 4 beasts are still there. And while in their presence, as great as they may have been, and as wonderful as those entities, symbolic entities, or however you want to describe them, no matter how wonderful and grand they were, they're not worthy of opening the seal either. They can't do it either. And so what's John's reaction? Here is a personal reaction to something he sees in verse 4. He cries. I wept. And wept what? King James language anyway. I wept much. You know, it's an interesting picture here. While in the Spirit, he sees these things, but John hasn't vacated his emotions. John, just because he's in the Spirit seeing these things, doesn't mean that he's vacated who he is. And when he realizes that there's a message, it's got to be important. It's in the right hand of the God of heaven sitting on His throne. There's got to be value in that message. It's so sealed, and now, as I see it, I see one barrier, the 7 seals, and the next thing I hear is an angel proclaiming that there isn't anybody worthy. And so John begins to weep, because no man was found worthy to open and to read the book, neither to look thereon. Not only could they not find somebody worthy to open it, there wasn't even anybody worthy to look at it, let alone reveal its message. So then one of the elders say what? Verse 5. Yeah, quit crying. Weep not, John. Weep not. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof. Not the 24 elders, not the 4 beasts. But he looks at John and says, John, the Lion from the tribe of Judah has the ability to open up the message that's revealed, that's held within the scroll. If you were to try to summarize or give a very simplistic concept of what the Lion of Judah, what Jesus accomplished, what would it be? What ultimately does He bring to man? Salvation, right? Ultimately, Jesus brings salvation to man. In His own words, I came to what? To seek and to save that which was lost. The eternal purpose of Jesus has always been in connection with the salvation of lost and dying. I think it's a fair connection that if the focus is there is one worthy to open up and reveal the message that's on the scroll or in the book, whichever description you want to use, and that is the Lion of Judah, that's Jesus, then I think there's probably a direct connection here between the message that's on the scroll and salvation that Jesus brings. What's in the right hand of the Creator, the God of the throne? It's the message of salvation. Who can not just take the seals off, but who can actually deliver that message? Who is worthy enough to actually deliver and bring salvation? Jesus. The Lion of Judah will open that seal up. The Lion of Judah will open up the scroll, and He will lead men to salvation through that great message. I think that's a fair description of what's happening here. So here's the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David. And there's an interesting statement in verse 5. He says, one of the elders said to me, don't weep not. Behold, the Lion of of the tribe of Judah. Or look, the lion. So when he tells John, take a look, what's John looking for? He's looking for a lion. What's he see? A lamb. It's an interesting piece of imagery here. The Lion of Judah, the root of David, the ancestry of David that ultimately would bring Jesus. The great strength of Jesus is revealed in His sacrifice. The great strength and power of the Lion of Judah is revealed in His sacrifice. So I was told to look, and so I did. Verse 6, John says, I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne, and of the four beasts, and in the midst of the elders stood a lamb, as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth into all the earth. Again, the concept of perfection. Here's this perfect message. Here's this imagery of a lamb, and yet initially described as the Lion of Judah, beheld as a lamb that had been slain. But not an ordinary lamb in this picture. A lamb that had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth into all the earth. Simplification for you. What's the Great Commission? What do we call that Great Commission? Go ye what? Go ye into all the world. Preach the, what's the gospel? Good news of Jesus. But in essence, the gospel is the message of salvation. What's in the right hand of God? Message of salvation. Who's worthy to open it? Only the Lamb. Jesus perfectly suited to do what man could not do for himself. My conclusion about this narrative is very simplistic, and that is that we're dealing here with what Jesus brings to man, which is salvation. And all the pictures and imageries and the thought processes that go along with them are interconnected to that basic principle. Jesus is the perfect solution to salvation. What had been hidden from man until the time of Jesus? Salvation. What had been sealed up, withheld in its completed form, in its perfect form? Salvation. Old Testament couldn't do it, could it? The Old Testament was imperfect because it could not remedy the challenge of sin. The Bible repeatedly reminds us of how the high priest entered the holiest of holies how many times? Once every year. They had to keep going back and making the same sacrifice. And go back and make the same sacrifice. Because it wasn't perfectly suited for what man needed. A real remedy for sin. And then John sees the Lamb that was slain in the midst. The perfect Lamb with perfect horns and perfect eyes, and the perfection of the Spirit of God sending out into all the earth to bring this message of salvation to man. I may be oversimplifying, but that's what I see. This wonderfully complete and perfect message of salvation being delivered to all the earth because of the Lamb that was willing to be slain. And so He comes, and He takes the book out of the right hand of Him that sat upon the throne. And when He had taken the book, the 4 beasts and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps and golden viols, full of odors, and which are the prayers of the saints. So worthy was the Lamb that the Lamb was allowed to walk up to where? To the throne and do what? Take the book. If there's any question about the divinity of Jesus, that should answer it right there, right? If there's any question about how Jesus bears the same quality and characteristic of deity, the very worthiness that this picture is describing of how He was able to walk up to that throne and take that message and reveal it, shows how important the Son of God is in this scheme. And so when He does, they begin to worship. And they begin to present, he says in verse 8, the prayers of saints. That phrase has become a challenge in some religious circles. And it's become a challenge because not because of the misconception of what's being presented before the throne of God, but it creates a challenge on the misunderstanding of who a saint is. And so when folks create a hierarchy system that says here are people who have been elevated to sainthood, and then those are the ones who have this privilege of being able to take our petitions before the throne of God. That's why we end up in some religious circles having the issue of people sending their prayers to these saints, and then those saints take that message before the throne. The conceptual problem is not necessarily the idea of these prayers being brought before the throne of God. The challenge is a misunderstanding of who the saints are. Very briefly, who does the New Testament describe as saints? Yeah, all the followers of Jesus. The saints which are in Philippi, or the saints that are, they're the followers of Jesus. And so the followers of Jesus have their prayers being put before the throne of God. Believers and disciples, followers of Jesus, have their message being heard. Again, don't overthink. What's their problem? I'm oppressed, I'm challenged, I'm hurting. Is God even me? Is my message even getting to the throne of God? And if so, how? Well, how is because the Lamb that was slain. Is it? Yes, because it's being delivered. It's being delivered for you and on your behalf before the throne of God. Again, don't get caught up in the imagery to the point that we miss the message. The thoughts and concerns and prayers of the saints of God are getting to His throne because of the Lamb that was slain. And so they begin to sing a new song, saying, Thou art worthy to take the book and to open the seals thereof. For Thou wast slain and hast redeemed us to God by Thy blood out of every kindred, tongue, and people and nation. There is your summation if you ever had one, right? What's this whole picture about, John? What is all this about? There you have it. As they sing in heaven a new song about what? Redemption. This whole imagery is about God's plan of redemption brought forth through His Son who was slain. All right. Lord willing, we'll come back on Wednesday and we will complete chapter 5. I thought we might get it through those imageries today, but we'll get back and finish the images of this praise and worthy worship that's being brought to the Lamb, and then we'll finish up chapter 5 and move into chapter 6 on Wednesday night, Lord willing.